Hey guys, today we step into the steam and soap of medieval Europe. Not the flea-infested filth hole you might expect, but a world of wooden tubs, herbal infusions, and surprisingly decent hygiene, at least for the time. But fair warning, if you're expecting loofahs and lavender bath bombs, you probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It starts with a creak of timber, the sound of a bathhouse door swinging open, spilling warm steam onto a cobbled lane. Inside, the scent isn't foul, it's earthy, sharp with rosemary, maybe even mint. Candles flicker in high iron sconces, casting long shadows across sweating stone walls. A row of round wooden tubs bubbles faintly. The room hums with quiet voices and the slosh of water being ladled and poured. It's not luxurious by modern standards, but for the 14th century villager, this is bliss. A bath, a real one. And it might be the cleanest they'll feel for weeks. Contrary to pop culture slander, medieval people did bathe, often communally, occasionally luxuriously, and with far more frequency than many assume. In major towns across Europe, public bathhouses operated openly, inspired in part by lingering Roman infrastructure and monastic cleanliness codes. Cities like Paris and Nuremberg had entire neighborhoods that smelled faintly of soap and steam. Patrons paid a small fee, stripped down, modesty optional depending on the year and the bishop, and soaked in shared warmth. Hot stones kept the water simmering. Birch branches might be used for a gentle lashing, part massage, part exfoliation, part blood circulation theatre. Mainstream historical fact: most medieval people, especially urban dwellers, bathed more regularly than many of their 19th century descendants. Victorian England, despite its lace and etiquette, was less obsessed with actual bodily cleanliness. The medievals, at least when not overwhelmed by plague or sermon, understood that a good bath could soothe joints, soften moods, and impress the neighbours. Not all bathers were equal, of course. Nobles had their private tubs, servants, and scented oils. Peasants might scrape by with a basin, a warmed bucket, and a stiff cloth. Still, the ritual mattered. Births, weddings, holy days, all had their associated washings. A groom scrubbed before his vows. A woman bathed in herbs after childbirth. Infants were rinsed in goat's milk or honey water to protect them from spirits and sickness. These weren't just chores, they were sacred acts, woven into belief. And that brings us to one of the quirkier habits: bath time snacks. Yes, snacks. In certain late medieval bathhouses, especially in German territories, patrons would be served food and drink while they soaked. Imagine a wooden tray floating beside you with spiced wine, dried figs, and a wedge of cheese. It's part spa, part tavern, part social club. People gossiped, flirted, even negotiated marriages while naked and pruny. There are illuminated manuscripts that show couples bathing together, their expressions serene, the wine flowing. Of course, church leaders were not thrilled. Bathhouses became frequent targets of moral campaigns, especially when they started doubling as, well, pleasure houses. Historians still argue whether some bathhouses ever truly separated bathing from brothel work, or whether that was just part of the whole steamy experience. Either way, bathing lost some of its medieval popularity not due to lack of interest, but fear. As the plague ravaged cities and fear of miasma, bad air grew, the practice of bathing publicly with open pores and damp skin suddenly felt like a terrible idea. Physicians advised against it. Porous skin, they warned, could absorb pestilence. Soap gave way to scented cloths. Linen undergarments became the new cleansing ritual. Wear clean, not be clean. But that's for later. Right now, back in our candlelit bathhouse, the water's warm, the conversation low, and a friar is rubbing sage into his beard. Because yes, monks bathed too. Not daily, perhaps, but regularly. The rule of St. Benedict prescribed a balance between cleanliness and piety. Monasteries often had their own bathhouses, and some, like the Cluniacs, took it seriously. Clean body, clean soul. Though, in practice, there were always a few crustier brethren who disagreed. In homes, bathing wasn't entirely forsaken. A wooden tub, sometimes lined with linen to avoid splinters, might be dragged before the hearth once a week. Heated water was poured in pot by pot. The whole family might take turns, starting with the father, then mother, then children in descending age. By the time the youngest climbed in, the water was a murky broth of sibling history. A fringe record from 15th century Wales mentions that in especially frugal households, even guests were offered reused bathwater, though whether that was hospitality or horror remains up for debate. And as the bathhouse door closes again, shutting the steam behind it, you begin to realize medieval cleanliness wasn't absent. It was simply different, earthier, more improvised, but deeply felt. The next morning begins not with a rooster crowing, but with the creak of a pump and the clatter of iron buckets against stone. In the cool hush of a medieval courtyard, a woman leans over a well, her breath misting in the dawn air. She hoists water hand over hand, the muscles in her forearm taut, and pours it into a wooden basin. The water's chill smacks her skin as she begins her morning ablutions. Face, neck, underarms. There's no soap in sight, but instead, a linen cloth and a bundle of dried herbs steeping in a nearby jug. The scent is sharp, lavender, sage, maybe even thyme. Contrary to the image of the unwashed peasant, many people in medieval Europe did in fact wash daily, at least their hands, faces and feet. Feet especially, after long days in muddy lanes or inside woolen shoes lined with straw. A clean face wasn't just vanity, it was ritual. One popular practice was to use rosewater or vinegar diluted in rainwater for a refreshing splash. In some regions, people believed these infusions warded off illness, because disease, after all, floated in bad smells, and roses were divine. One mainstream historical fact is that hand-washing before meals was widespread, even expected. In noble households, guests were greeted with a ewer of warm water and a towel before dining. Entire ceremonies revolved around the washing of hands, especially among clergy and kings. In France, servants carried bowls of perfumed water through banquet halls, while minstrels played soft tunes. In monasteries, hand-washing was a ritual that preceded prayer and meals alike, blending piety and hygiene into a single act. And yet, quirks abound. One odd but well-documented belief held that washing the head too often weakened the brain. Because of this, hair washing was approached cautiously. A peasant might rinse their hair with lye soap once or twice a month, using rainwater collected in barrels. Some folks combed ashes into their scalp to absorb oils and mask odor. Wealthier women preferred rosemary infused rinses or vinegar soaks, followed by painstaking detangling with wide-toothed bone combs. There are even accounts of people using stale beer for shine, because if it's good enough for drinking, why not scrubbing? Inside a bustling town, bathhouses and street-side stalls sold rudimentary soap, usually made from animal fat and wood ash. It was gritty, grey and rough on the skin, but it did the job. Some soap makers, especially in Islamic Spain, had refined the craft, producing bars perfumed with spices, wrapped in linen. Christian Europe was slower to catch up, but still, soap was known and used, just not daily. One Flemish record from 1327 notes that a servant was paid 1 penny for washing garments and a half for scrubbing the master's feet. Scrubbing someone else's feet, a chore truly deserving of hazard pay. Historians still argue whether common folk cared more about cleanliness than surviving plague, famine, or war, but evidence suggests many did both. Medieval towns enforced sanitary codes surprisingly often. Butchers were fined for dumping animal guts near wells. Tanners had to keep their foul trade at the edge of town. Laws in London required homeowners to keep their drains clean. Filth meant disease, and while germ theory was centuries away, noses worked just fine. Not everything medieval was scrubbed and shining, of course. Garbage piled up in alleys, especially in summer. Lice were common. People carried wooden lice combs tucked in their belts, yes, belts, alongside small pouches of dried herbs to mask body odor. A traveling merchant might rub himself with lavender before entering a town, partly to impress, partly to avoid gagging on his own stench. But in quieter villages, the ritual of cleanliness was as much spiritual as physical. Washing before entering church, washing before breaking bread, washing a child's face with the edge of one's cloak. In some cultures, water had near sacred significance. Slavic communities bathed communally before weddings. In parts of Italy, families took turns washing in spring-fed stone troughs while exchanging blessings. There was rhythm to it, a cadence that spoke not of filth, but of survival, pride, and presence. And as we step inside a narrow home with a thatched roof and a tiled hearth, the mother is heating water in a clay pot. Her toddler splashes his feet in a shallow tub. The older daughter is scrubbing linen in the corner, lye soap in hand, knuckles red. Outside, smoke rises from chimneys, not from lack of hygiene, but from the fire it took to keep clean. So no, not everyone reeked. Not all teeth rotted, and certainly not all hair was matted and crawling. Sometimes, cleanliness wasn't just possible, it was expected. Just in a slightly itchier, splinterier, and smokier way than we're used to, out in the countryside, far from the chatter of towns and the echo of cathedral bells, bathing takes on a rhythm all its own. The forest stream is cold even in late spring, but its banks are familiar, worn smooth by years of barefoot pilgrims, shepherds, and scullery maids. A young man kneels at the water's edge, shirt rolled up, scrubbing his arms with a bundle of moss and crushed mint leaves. Not for show, not even for health, just habit, one passed down from his grandmother, who claimed mint could banish bad dreams and foot rot alike. Cleanliness here is seasonal. In summer, villagers might wash often, rivers and ponds make it easy. Children leap into cool shallows, laughing, while parents pretend they're just fishing. But winter is another story. The water freezes. Fires must be coaxed from damp logs. Tubs, if they exist, are stored in barns or used as apple bins. Hygiene becomes pragmatic. Wipe with cloth. Change into a clean tunic if you have one. If not, turn it inside out and hope for the best. One mainstream historical fact often ignored: water wasn't universally feared in the medieval world. That myth of people avoiding baths like the plague is mostly the invention of later centuries. Sure, plague doctors warned against opening pores, but for much of the early and high Middle Ages, water was viewed as cleansing both spiritually and physically. Pilgrims bathed before setting out. Knights washed before battle. Even executioners, in some cultures, purified themselves after the act, perhaps more out of superstition than sanitation. Still, the quirky details remain irresistible. Like the documented case of a German noble who insisted his bath water be tested with a silver spoon before he'd touch it, lest poison or devils be lurking beneath the suds. Or the apocryphal tale of a nun in 12th century France who refused to bathe for 30 years as penance for vanity. They say her body didn't decay. Others say it just smelled too bad for rats. Inside castles, the story shifts again. Stone walls and tapestries surround small rooms, where servants pour water into elaborate basins carved from marble or wood. Ladies in waiting brush long hair by candlelight, catching lice between their fingers and tossing them into the fire. Lords sit in deep tubs with pewter cups of spiced wine, barked at by dogs, half-dressed and fully pink. Hygiene here becomes performative. To be clean is to be noble. To stink is peasantry clinging to your skin. A visiting envoy might be offered a warming towel, basically a damp rag steeped in clove water, before a meal. Not for scrubbing, but for sniffing. A sort of olfactory handshake. And yet, not all elite practices were scented with roses. One fringe account describes how some nobles, especially those embracing extreme piety, believed regular bathing invited vanity. These eccentrics wore hair shirts, refused soap, and let lice crawl as divine punishment. Monks might argue cleanliness distracted from God. Flagellants, those travelling penitents who whipped themselves in public, saw bodily discomfort as holy. Historians still argue whether such practices were mainstream or merely the colourful exceptions that grabbed chroniclers' attention. Meanwhile, back in town, bathhouses still do business, with modifications. Some shift to offering dry baths, essentially perfumed powders and vigorous cloth rubdowns. Others operate only for women on specific days of the week, fearing temptation. In England, civic authorities attempt to regulate bathhouse behaviour with moral ordinances. No drinking, no singing, no mixed soaking. It works briefly, but the truth is, for every rule, there's a workaround. Lovers meet in shadowy corners of communal tubs. Priests sneak in, faces hidden under hoods. And barbers, because yes, barbers often ran bathhouses, become confidants, hearing secrets whispered beneath steam. Barbershops and bathhouses overlap in more than just steam. A man might enter for a shave, a haircut, and a scrape. Literally. The barber surgeon might lance boils, pull teeth, or apply leeches, all while recommending a rosemary foot bath. The room smells of blood, sweat, and soap. And in the corner sits a brass bowl with petals floating lazily, a poor man's luxury. As the centuries creep forward, the line between medicine and cleanliness blurs. Apothecaries begin selling washing salts and plague powders made from crushed juniper and powdered ambergris. Wealthy merchants travel with personal bathing kits, tiny bronze mirrors, tweezers, combs, cloths. Hygiene becomes portable, if not full baths, then at least targeted scrubbing, armpits, hands, neck, strategic cleanliness. In poorer homes, vinegar is the great equalizer, used to wipe floors, freshen clothing, and occasionally as mouthwash. Children gag but comply. One boy in the 1480s. Florence is noted for refusing his daily rinse and being locked outside until he changed his mind. He did. Quickly. So while the medieval world never smelled like a spa, it wasn't the festering horror show we often imagine either. Cleanliness was work, it was improvisation, and above all, it was social. To be clean was to be part of a rhythm, of worship, of community, of humanity. In monasteries, cleanliness carried a different weight, equal parts discipline and symbolism. Monks rose before dawn, slipping into rough robes and walking barefoot across cold stone floors toward the lavatorium, a communal washing area set apart by a long stone trough. Water flowed through bronze spouts shaped like lions' mouths, trickling into the basin below. Here, they'd scrub hands, faces, and forearms before meals, prayers, and manual labor. Silence was kept, but the occasional splash echoed like a hymn. Monastic hygiene was structured by the rule of St. Benedict, which emphasized both physical and spiritual purity. Washing was mandatory before sacred rites and communal eating. But full immersion? That was rare. Some orders allowed bathing once a month, others only a few times a year unless illness or filth truly demanded it. Still, monks often washed their feet more regularly, a symbolic nod to Christ's humility. They used ash soap, coarse linen, and sometimes warmed their water with hot stones dropped from the hearth. One mainstream historical fact: Monasteries were among the cleanest places in medieval Europe. They had structured water systems, even rudimentary plumbing in some abbeys. The same channels that fed their fish ponds also flushed away waste, slowly, and not always effectively, but with surprising forethought for the 12th century. But then, there's the fringe tale of Brother Martin, a monk in the Rhineland who reportedly tried to invent holy steam, a room filled with incense and boiling herbs where monks could purify their lungs and souls. The idea didn't catch on. Too much coughing, not enough divine revelation. In the cities, bathhouses wax and wane with the seasons of plague. When times are good, they're full of gossip, candles, and rosewater. When plague returns, shutters close. People fear that heat opens the pores, and the devil rides in on disease. The belief spreads that water might carry sickness, that baths weaken the humours. Physicians start advising against full-body soaks. They recommend dry sponging and alcohol rubs instead. By the late 14th century, public bathhouses across Paris and London begin to fall out of fashion. Historians still argue whether this shift was based on science, superstition, or just a convenient excuse to avoid bathing in winter. But the consequences are real. Cleanliness becomes classed. Nobles retreat to private rooms with basins and towels. Peasants make do with rivers and buckets. Communal rituals vanish. Still, traditions linger. In the Low Countries, bathhouse festivals are remembered. Days when entire neighborhoods took turns scrubbing, soaking, and singing together. Children would race soap bubbles down cobbled alleys. Elders passed down recipes for flower infusions that softened skin and supposedly protected against demons. These little joys don't vanish overnight. Even in dark times, people try. A young woman in plague-era Florence is documented preparing a dry bath for her sick father. She rubs him with warmed cloth soaked in sage, then wraps him in a linen sheet dusted with fine sand. It's not effective by modern standards, but it's an act of love, of care, a form of hygiene deeply human. In remote mountain villages, washing becomes a weekly ritual tied to market day or Sunday mass. Families bathe one after the other in the same water, oldest to youngest, cleanest to dirtiest. The bucket is boiled with thyme, poured into a wooden tub. The steam curls into the rafters. A dog licks up the spill on the floor. The baby cries, always. And someone shouts from the hearth that the soap's gone missing again. A quirky note from 15th century Wales tells of a woman who created honey baths for her husband, mixing river water with raw honey and heating it with sun-warmed stones. She claimed it made him less cranky. The local priest warned her it was indulgent. She told him to try it. Meanwhile, back in royal courts, bathing becomes pageantry again. Queens are attended by maids with silver jugs, gilded combs, and embroidered towels. Perfumed oils are dabbed behind the ears. Musicians play softly in corners. It's not about dirt anymore. It's about display. Being seen as clean becomes a political act. And yet, all across the spectrum, from prince to pig farmer, some things stay the same. The feeling of warm water on sore skin, the comfort of scraping away the day, the quiet moment of standing still, dripping, while the fire pops and crackles behind you. Over in the bustling corners of medieval Spain, the influence of Islamic culture still lingers in the form of public bathhouses, known as hammams. These aren't just cleaning stations, they're centers of community life. Men and women visit on alternate days, sometimes whole families gather. Heated rooms are carefully tiered, warm, hotter, hottest. Terracotta pipes hum underfoot, steam curls from the stones. This isn't the occasional splash of water behind a barn, it's a ceremony of purification. Tiles glisten with geometric designs. Aromatic oils, cedar, olive, rose, are massaged into skin by attendants. Conversations drift in Arabic, Latin, even early Castilian. You can buy snacks, hear news, or get advice on childbirth, all while lounging in a towel. For a few coins, you get clean and maybe even enlightened. It's a legacy of Roman baths, reimagined through Islamic hygiene laws and Spanish sensibilities. One mainstream historical fact: bathing was central to Muslim life, and where Islamic influence reached into medieval Europe, Sicily, southern France, Spain, public hygiene bloomed. Baths weren't sinful, they were sacred. But here comes the quirky. An account from Cordoba describes a donkey being brought into a bathhouse to relax its joints on the advice of a particularly eccentric healer. It did not go well. Floors were mopped for days. Elsewhere in Christian Europe, bishops start raising eyebrows at these lush customs. They worry hammams are too much like dens of indulgence. Too many naked bodies, too much mingling. Bathers' morality, some priests call it, implying that too much washing might scrub away your virtue along with your dirt. Still, the trend spreads. In Montpellier, in Marseille, in Palermo, bathhouses pop up along the trade routes, bringing exotic rituals with them. Historians still argue whether these baths truly represented cultural integration, or if they simply served as a place where cultures tolerated each other's damp bodies for a few hours before returning to prejudice. What is clear? The hammams survived far longer in these mixed cities than anywhere else in Europe. But in the north, where winter's bite and fuel is scarce, warmth becomes a luxury. Peasants improvise with foot baths, small buckets filled with boiled water and herbs like marjoram or tansy. These are less about cleanliness, more about soothing swollen joints after a day hauling wood or threshing grain. A grandmother might soak her feet while telling stories about saints and spirits, steam rising into the rafters as children cluster around her ankles. In some towns, people begin crafting makeshift bath benches, wide planks balanced over barrels, allowing someone to sit and scrub without dunking fully into the freezing water. It's efficient. A kind of medieval sponge bath. Cloths are soaked in vinegar and sage, wrung out, and used to wipe underarms, faces, necks. Linen towels hang near the fire to dry. They smell faintly of smoke and lavender. As guilds emerge, tradespeople develop bathing rituals tied to their work. Tanners wash in lye, blacksmiths soak soot from their skin with alewort, weavers rinse dye from fingers in buckets of ash water. Cleanliness becomes occupational, not always thorough, not always gentle, but deliberate. The court physician in Prague once wrote that a man must know how to wash the hands in the morning, the feet before bed, and the soul before death. His guide, penned in elegant Latin, advised washing with rainwater, believed to be closer to heaven. Another passage suggests bathing during a thunderstorm is excellent for balancing melancholic humours, though most folks were likely too busy hiding from lightning to test the theory. In the countryside, rain often is the bath. Children strip down and run shrieking through summer showers. Women scrub laundry in streams while soaking their arms. A boy climbs into a barrel filled with rainwater just to avoid a scolding. Rain is nature's bathhouse, free and unfiltered. But there are also dark tales, warnings of bathing during certain moon phases, or when bells toll at funerals. One 14th century folktale from the Baltics tells of a girl who bathed during an eclipse and emerged mute. These stories aren't widespread, but they're whispered enough to keep some people shivering in their tunics rather than risk a cursed soak. And yet the basic yearning remains: to be clean, to feel human, to start fresh after a long day of muck, soot, sweat, and prayer. In every corner of medieval Europe, no matter how grim the times or filthy the roads, people find ways to rinse and scrub, to peel away the day, even if only with a cloth and a handful of rose petals. In the bathhouses of Prague and Krakow, steam coils from rooftops like smoke from a baker's oven. Inside, wax candles flicker along stone walls streaked with condensation, and the scent of juniper and linden root clings to the mist. Here, bath attendants, often older women with sharp tongues and sharper elbows, cluck orders as they pour hot water into wooden tubs. It's not just bathing, it's bodywork. Limbs are scrubbed raw with linen cloths, scalps massaged with pine oil, joints cracked with brisk enthusiasm. Customers moan in a mix of pain and relief. These establishments double as barbershops, surgeons' parlours, even matchmaking hubs. You can come in for a shave, leave with a new haircut, bandaged blister, an unsolicited marriage proposal. It's oddly efficient. One mainstream historical fact: bathhouses in Central Europe often functioned as multi-purpose wellness centres, places to cleanse body, gossip, and spirit. City records show officials monitoring their activity closely, especially when morality campaigns flare up. But things get dicey. A 14th century account from Lübeck mentions a bathhouse that secretly offered night visits from friendly spirits in the form of well-dressed courtesans. That house was shut down twice, then mysteriously reopened under new management with the same curtains. Bathhouses, it seems, walk a thin line between wellness and suspicion. Meanwhile, across the Channel in England, bathing becomes a class performance. Nobles commission elaborate bathing rooms within their manors, octagonal chambers with lead-lined tubs, skylights, and carved wooden racks for drying silk towels. They are filled not just with water, but orchestras of smell. Rosemary, bay, elderflower, and orange peels steeped in boiling water. Sometimes the bath water itself is infused with goat's milk or vinegar, depending on whether the goal is soft skin or spiritual renewal. One noblewoman in 15th century Kent insisted on rose petals from her own garden, changed daily. Her tub, a copper basin big enough for two, often shared with her lapdog. These aren't just baths, they're declarations of status, a subtle "I'm cleaner than you" flex. But downstairs, among the servants, the story is grimmer. A single pail of grey water might serve 6 pairs of hands and one very unlucky chamber pot. If you're last in line, you're not washing, you're stewing. Back in France, the Parisian poor make use of the city's public fountains and cisterns. At dawn, you can see laundresses wringing out clothes while boys splash water onto their heads from cracked clay pitchers. A baker's apprentice sneaks in a full-body dunk before his shift. The water is cold and murky, but it's free, and no one asks questions. Washing in public becomes a kind of ritual, fast, discreet, communal. You bring your own cloth, your own soap, and your own sense of modesty, which, in some quarters, means keeping your shirt on even while scrubbing your back. Not far off, in rural Brittany, villagers construct sweat huts, crude wooden cabins packed with heated stones. Men huddle inside, sweat streaming from their faces, tossing handfuls of wild thyme onto the rocks. Once their pores are wide and their spirits cleansed, they leap into a nearby stream, whooping as the cold hits. It's invigorating, it's ancient, it's surprisingly effective. Quirky custom: in some alpine villages, people believed that if you added elderberry branches to your bath, you'd ward off lice for a whole season. Whether or not that worked, it made the water smell amazing. The church, meanwhile, continues its seesaw stance on bathing. Some monks still denounce fleshly pleasures like warm water. Others endorse it, within reason, especially for the sick and the dying. In 1487, an Italian friar wrote a guidebook titled "Washing Without Sin," in which he detailed the 7 virtuous uses of bathing. His list included preparation for prayer, comfort of the sick, and softening of the sinner's heart. Critics called it indulgent. His readers called it useful. Sales were steady. Historians still argue whether this growing interest in cleanliness was tied to rising literacy and access to classical texts, or simply a pragmatic response to dirt, disease, and social climbing. Maybe both. What's certain is this: medieval people weren't oblivious to hygiene. They just navigated it with what they had: weather, wood, herbs, superstition. and a lot of communal patience. And when night falls, and the hearth dims, and you've wiped the last of the soap from your eyes, you step from the tub into the cool air of a stone house. You dry with linen, slip into wool, and sleep better knowing the dirt of the day didn't follow you into your dreams. And just when you thought we'd rinsed the last of it, a candle flickers near a monk's cot in a damp monastery corridor. Here, the rituals of bathing veer closer to theology than hygiene. Monastic rules vary wildly. Some orders mandate weekly baths. Others allow just 4 a year, not 4 times, 4 occasions. Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, and your deathbed. Maybe, depending on whether you've behaved. But some monks, particularly in the more scholarly Benedictine communities, embrace regular washing as a sign of inner discipline. They bathe in icy river water before sunrise, wrapped in their wool habits like soggy loaves. A novice might be handed a bar of soap made from ash and sheep fat, along with a warning: too much scrubbing invites vanity. Yet even so, within these stone walls, the pursuit of cleanliness is often interpreted as a quiet rebellion against rot, spiritual and physical. In the private chambers of certain abbots, records describe copper tubs set beside hearths, herbal infusions simmering in clay pots, and fresh linen robes laid out for post-bath reflection. Is this luxury? Possibly. Or maybe it's just the medieval version of self-care. After all, even saints need a rinse now and then. Outside the cloister, in plague-ridden towns, water becomes both remedy and risk. Some believe that bathing opens the pores and invites disease into the body. Better to sweat it out in wool, some argue, than strip down and soak. Others insist that washing is essential, that clean skin repels pestilence. Public health ordinances are issued. Bathhouses are closed, then reopened, then burned. People don't know what to believe, but they know they don't want to smell like death. In plague years, soap prices spike. So do amulets shaped like scallop shells, worn around the neck to absorb miasmas during washing. It's not just about soap anymore, it's about ritual protection. Mothers sprinkle vinegar into bathwater, whispering prayers. Fathers dunk their children in cold wells at sunrise, hoping it shocks their little bodies into resilience. It doesn't always work. But what else is there? And yet, through it all, bathing never disappears. It adapts. It hides in corners and customs. It waits in the steam of a rural sweat hut, or the soft slap of cloth on wood. It travels in memory, in the wisdom of herbalists and midwives who know the difference between rosemary for circulation and lavender for sleep. It passes from hand to hand in the form of homemade soap, shared buckets, whispered advice. One quirky note to end on. In some parts of Wales, it was customary to bathe newborns in beer. Weak ale, to be clear, because it was considered safer than water and believed to imbue strength. Whether this worked is debatable. But hey, the kid smelled great. Historians still argue whether medieval bathing habits were truly lost in later centuries or just reframed by changing tastes and Protestant austerity. What's clear is this: for all the dirt, all the superstition, all the myths that later centuries pinned on the so-called Dark Ages, medieval people cared about being clean, maybe not every day, maybe not by our standards. But in their own fragrant, steam-filled, herb-scented way, they understood the dignity of washing away the world, one bucket, one petal, one rainstorm at a time. And now, as the candles burn low and the basin cools, let's bring this to a gentle close. Imagine the warmth of herbal steam on your cheeks, the weight of wool drying by a hearth. Outside, the wind rustles through thatch and ivy, but inside, everything is still, quiet, clean. No alarms, no tiles, no showerheads. Just the hum of history, warm water, cold stone, and the soft sound of a world remembering how to care for itself.